All right, it was September of 2017. Mark and I had went to Lee Creek for an outing. We'd got there and we'd met Debbie and the girls and several other people. They'd talked about all the activity they'd had previously in this area, and we had cooked steaks and stuff, ate, went down to the creek and hung out there, and somebody started throwing rocks in the creek, and we were getting rocks thrown back off the little bluff that was across the creek that didn't have any access by any roads or anything. That went on for probably an hour or so. It kind of dissipated after a while, and we all walked back to camp. It probably was about 12:30 at that point, and Mark and I had camped away from everybody else in the main camp. We'd crossed the creek and went back in the woods probably 150, 200 yards from the creek on the other side away from everybody. We had a four-wheeler and we left the main camp because it was probably, distance-wise, it was probably a half mile from everybody. We crossed the creek, got back to our camp, cut off the ATV, and as soon as we cut off the ATV, we had a loud howl. It's one of the closest ones I've heard, except possibly one more, but me and Mark looked at each other, shrugged our shoulders and rolled over, and he went to his hammock, I got in my hammock, we went to sleep. About 2:30, I started smelling something that was rank. I was asleep and it woke me up. I was sniffing, trying to figure out what it was. I thought, I've been camping for 3 days. Is it me? Is it my breath? What is it? But
is it my breath?
Yeah, but it wasn't. I could hear something walk as I woke up. I could hear something walking away from the head end of my hammock, and I tried to turn. I had a thermal, I had a pistol, and I had a light all across my lap in the hammock. And I tried to turn with the thermal to get it on thermal, and I couldn't turn enough at the angle it was to get it on thermal. So I laid there and held the thermal up over my head, pointing it behind me, and just scanned it over my head, trying to pick something up. It probably walked 50 yards from us and stopped whenever I started moving. And you could tell it was bipedal and all that, but I just took the thermal back down and laid there still, and after a few minutes I heard it walk off toward the creek and away from us. The next day I told Mark about it, and Mark or Shelley reviewed the audio later, and you could hear for 30 minutes prior to me waking up, the thing would throw rocks. You could hear it ping off the ATV. You could hear it hit close to me, and you could hear the feet shuffle a little bit, and it would stop, and you wouldn't hear nothing for a little while, and it would throw more stuff in to see what it was going to take to wake me up. And I don't know how close the thing was whenever I finally smelt it, but it had to be within 20 yards of me whenever I finally woke up, because when it took off walking, it was close. And believe it or not, Mark didn't wake up through it. He was over there about 20 or 30 yards from me. He didn't know about it till the next morning. I didn't jump up and run over there and wake him up. I just went back to sleep, and about 4 in the morning, something else come into camp, but I got it on thermal, and it was just a raccoon or an armadillo. But it sounded totally different.
But you were worried, weren't you?
No.
Well, you were thinking.
I was thinking, but I wasn't worried.
Yeah.
It affected me worse later after I thought about it, how close I was to whatever it was, than it did that night. And then I started putting my hammock up in the middle of everybody instead of on the outside of everybody.
You know what'll happen? If there's one thing that I don't mention or add it, it'll be like, oh, he's lying.
Here's what you...
I was with a friend of mine, and we were coon hunting, and I was new to it. He'd been taking me coon hunting some. We were down in Jackson County, Indiana, and we were down in the river bottoms. We were very close to the river, actually. but we're kind of in between two towns. We were between a town called Valonia and a town called Medora, Indiana. So we run the dogs, and they were way out ahead of us, and we were still up by the gravel road. We took off down toward the dogs. They were carrying on pretty good. We got down there where they were carrying on, and we come up to this ravine, and this ravine is not where the river flows. It only flows like through there when the river gets out.
Right.
And it kind of cuts new channels and stuff, over the years. And then when the river flows out of them, they grow up, and they grow up with a lot of junk in them, and vines and bushes. Either way, this ravine we come up on is pretty deep, estimating 10, 12 feet deep. It was pretty deep, or washout, or whatever you want to call it. The dogs was carrying on pretty good, and it was going on for a while, and they were down in all this thick stuff. Every once in a while, they come by, and we have these big coon lights, and it's the old style coon lights where you had like the metal hat and it had the headlight on it, kind of like a coal miner's type hat.
Yep.
And it had those big old battery packs on your side. It always pulled your pants down and killed your hip,
Old school lights.
Oh yeah, old school. So we were getting kind of bored with it, and there's a tree growing up like right there beside the drop off, and it's real muddy. And I'm just leaning up against that tree, and my buddy Tim is to my left. He's a little ways away from me, but not that far. And we got our lights, and we're shining this ravine, It's growed up real thick. You literally can't even see the dogs. You hear the dogs down in there. We kind of just hanging out, and one of the dogs got sounding a little bit different. And keep in mind, I'm new at this. They have different tones, different sounds, and they tree a coon, and I'm not that familiar with it, but it sounded different.
Yep.
Caught me a little bit off guard, and I thought, maybe something's going on. We're both shining the ravine still. We have the handheld lights. All of a sudden, I see this dog come through the air. And when I say come through the air, keep in mind, this ravine is, I'm estimating 10, 12 feet deep, and it's really wide. You can't jump across the ravine.
Right.
Carl Lewis can't jump across that ravine. Couldn't do it. A dog cannot jump across that ravine. It's too wide. This dog comes through the air, not in an upward angle or coming down or anything, comes across straight, and it's like it happened in slow motion. And this dog has kind of got this, it's not in balance, like a dog jumps out of a ditch.
Right.
But it hits and it tumbles a little bit, only because it didn't really fall, it just came straight across. I was just frozen in time, and my eyes was huge, I'm sure, and I look at Tim, because he's the experienced guy. Well, not really. He was only 16 too. And we're looking at each other and putting lights in each other's face, and his eyes are real big around. He's puzzled by what he sees. First thing I said was, "What was that? Why did that?
Yeah.
What? It's even hard for me to explain. It's like the dog. Your first reaction was somebody threw the dog. Well, yeah, somebody did throw the dog." But this dog is like 40 pounds, 50 pounds. Yeah, I'm guessing. You can't throw the dog that straight.
No.
You can't do it. The dog came across there like that. I kept saying, what was that? And he instantly just kind of accepted it like it wasn't nothing. He just said, well, it just jumped up out of there. That dog didn't jump up out of there.
Yeah.
That dog would have landed on its feet had it jumped out of there. So that was the end of that. We headed back to the dog just kept going. It was back on its feet and it kept going. The whole time we're walking that field, it's like I'm almost walking backwards because I'm wondering what that is. Is that going to come and throw me?
Yeah.
I keep asking him, I'm like, dude, you seen what I seen? What was that? Well, I don't, He just rejected it mentally right away. But I didn't forget it.
So, but was the dog yelping or anything?
The only thing it did was they were yapping when they're down in there doing their thing, and the one dog started sounding different, kind of like it was stressed really bad or something, like something was going on. Something was different.
Yeah.
And it seemed it was just the one dog, but there was two dogs down there. It didn't take him long though. We was headed out. We were not far behind the dog. It was headed to the truck, the best I could tell. But when we got to the truck, the dog was at the truck.
What about the other
The
dogs?
other one,
They just came
came
right
too,
with y'all?
came right up. He was yelling, and it come right up, back up behind us.
And I asked
We
you-
actually beat it to the truck.
I asked you this before, but you didn't put this together. You didn't even
No,
connect this with anything Bigfoot related.
no,
A long time. Right?
no. Just puzzled by what could have done that. That was it. You know, short of Bigfoot, reading a few books when I was a kid and
That's awesome.
stuff like that.
Because most times these stories you hear, they kill the dog,
Yeah,
or the
Yeah.
dog is so scared, you know, and these coon dogs are mean. They attack, they want to kill those coons. But this
Yeah,
dog
that's
didn't
crazy.
run or anything. Looked like maybe it just got snatched up and thrown.
beats me.
5-ish that next morning, something came into camp, but this had a totally different feel, and we could actually see the shadows on the tent. It was huge, and we could make out the shoulders and head, and another one came up to the left side of it, and it was coming up from the front of our tent where the fire was out there, and I pushed on Sandy's cot with my foot, and she looked over, and I went, she looked up, and she could see the shadows. And she pushed on Barbara's tent and did the same thing. So they all saw that. You could hear the footfall. And I had my recorder going out in the back left corner of my tent, and Barbara had hers out in the front. So anyway, they walk around. You could hear them moving. They weren't running around throwing crap at us like we think juveniles, you know. But anyway, it was just a totally different feel. And I've never been scared or felt any kind of fear until then, you know. And so anyway, it was 6:29 because I keep my phone under my pillow so I can see what time it is. 6:29 from the back left corner where my audio recorder is. It was this high-pitched, female-sounding scream, and it was real shrill, and then it ended in like a whoop, and then 10 seconds later, another one it was the same being that did it, I'm sure, because it was the exact same scream, exact same area, same thing. And we were like, that's the Medusa scream. That guy was legit. We understood now what he was talking about, but it was Bigfoot, I'm sure. Yeah. So the next night, same exact stuff. Those juveniles, they're back, you know, little less activity, you know, and then that next morning, about the same time, they come into camp again. It did it 3 nights in a row. The 4th night it was raining, and it was a lot less activity, but we still had them coming into camp. But on that second night, if you went on past where that guy had been camping, you go another several miles down, and the road ends, and there's a campground. And there were some bear hunters down there. And we had talked to them every day. We'd go down there because we wanted to keep up with who was where, you know. And so the second night, way off in that direction where the bear hunters were, we heard 4 gunshots. And I said, well, they're either drinking and getting rowdy or they're having something going on in camp. And then just not even a minute or so later, we heard 2 more gunshots. And then within a minute or so, we heard that Medusa scream from that area over there. And I'm like, oh yeah, they're having activity. That's what they're shooting at. And so we were excited. And then the 3rd night, somewhere between them and us, we heard the Medusa scream again. And so we're like, that poor young guy must have been scared out of his mind. But anyway, that was really cool because we thought he was on drugs or something, talking about sounding like a
killer carried a sword around with him.
Yeah, yeah.
It's funny when you say Medusa scream. You call my sister that.
Really?
Yeah. Every time you say Medusa, I'm like, yeah, she doesn't really scream.
I know, that's what I was like. We even talked about it after he left, you know, before we went down there. I'm like, what was he talking about, Medusa scream? It just didn't make sense, but then we were like, okay. Because it did. It was so high-pitched. You know how you hear on movies pterodactyls and stuff? Yeah. That's exactly what it was reminiscent of. But I got excited because my recorder was right in that corner where that scream was coming from. Cool. And Barbara went ahead that next morning and got hers and played it back, and it picked it up good on hers, and hers was in front. So when Shelley listens to it, she ought to hear something good on there. Well, it was really high-pitched, and all 3 of us, we all said it sounded female. But we just had a feeling that it was like an alpha female. I think she was finally like saying, "This is it, leave." Yeah. So it was pretty Interesting.
Kitties and saying, let's go now.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating.
I'd never heard that scream like that before. And if it hadn't had the whoop on the end, I would have said, don't know what the heck that was. But it had a whoop on the end. Well, I've heard other stuff, but not sound like that.
Tell them about your daddy and y'all's experience down there.
Well, where I grew up, I lived in Malta, Texas. We only had just a few hundred people in the little community. The school went to 8th grade, and I was valedictorian in my 8th grade class. And I normally don't tell people, but there was only 3 of us. We had like 2 grades in each classroom, so 5th and 6th were together, 7th and 8th were together. And once you got out 8th grade, you had to go to high school in either New Boston, which was 7 miles in one direction, or in DeKalb, which was 7 miles in the opposite direction. And I ended up going to both, and so because DeKalb was just more down to earth, I think. And anyway, so where this place was located, though, was only probably about 30-40 miles from Fouke, Arkansas, which is legendary in the Bigfoot community, because of the legend of Boggy Creek. And a lot of my cousins lived up in Texarkana and in that area, and some of my cousins lived in Fouke. And my mama and daddy had adopted me when they were 41, and so I already had 2 brothers that were 20 some odd years older than me. So all my first cousins were in their 20s, and so I grew up with my second cousins, and I grew up playing with my second cousins in those woods in Fouke, Arkansas. But back then, when I was a kid, we didn't know that Bigfoot even existed. We didn't know what a Bigfoot was, and I didn't even really know about it until I was in my early 20s or so. But what we called that creature in Fouke, Arkansas was the Fouke monster. That's all we ever heard was the Fouke monster. My mama and daddy and everybody would say, oh, honey, that's not real. But then the Legend of Boggy Creek movie came out, and we went to see it, and she really had to tell me that because it said, based on true events. And I went with my cousins, and we were all looking at our parents like, what? And they were saying, no, honey, that's just a movie. They just do that to make it more exciting. And so we were like, okay, Anyway, when I was about 14 years old, it was Christmas time. And my mama was sick. She had cancer, and so she was in the bed in the front room of our house. And my daddy and I were on the front porch hanging Christmas lights, and they were blue Christmas lights. And so it didn't light up very much, and we had the front porch light off because we could see better where we were putting them and spacing the Christmas lights out. We had a long house. It was almost like, a long shotgun type house. On the left-hand side of the porch was the carport. Then on the right, it was just, we had woods all the way around us and a pond back behind us and a dirt road in front of us. It was so dark out there, and we were on the right-hand side of the house, opposite from the carport. And when we were hanging the Christmas lights, coming from the left hand further on down, away from us, sounded like it was coming from on the other side of where my mama's house used to be next door. We heard just this, it was so scary. It was like a moan, a roar, and a growl all together. And I had never heard anything like that before, and it was so loud, it's just, whoa, and it scared the crap out of me. And I looked at my daddy, and I was like, what was that, Daddy? And he just paused for a second, and he said, I don't know what that was, but let's just hurry up and finish this. Well, my daddy, like I said, he was 41 when he adopted me, and that was back in '66 when I was born. So my daddy had been in 3 wars, Vietnam, World War II, and Korea. And he never was scared of anything. But I could just tell that, he stopped and looked in that direction, but he's like, let's go ahead and finish this. And so I was like, well, let's go in. Because I've never heard anything like that before. And he was like, no, let's just go ahead and finish this. And so we're trying to get it up. And thank goodness it was not a very long porch. But as we're working our way to the left, we get to about the center, and we hear it again. but this time it's closer up. And he says, go in the house and get my gun. And I said, I'm not leaving you out here. And I said, please, come on, let's go in the house. He goes, no, just hurry up, go in the house and get my gun. I said, no, Daddy. I was about starting to cry, you know. I said, let's go in the house, please. And about that time, from the carport area, we heard it again. And this time I just busted out in tears, and he's pushing me in the house, and he just pushes right on by me. Well, my mama was, you know, right there in that first front room in the bed, and she sees me, you know, crying, and he's running through the house going to go find his gun, then he's coming back out, and she's like, what's going on? And I'm like, there's a monster outside, and it's roar, you know, and I'm trying to make the sound for her, and I'm worried because Daddy now has just gone out there. And so I go into my room, which was on the opposite side from where my mama was, and on the side that the carport was on, and I'm looking out the windows, following him around the house to make sure nothing got him. And he comes back in there, and he's like, there's nothing out there. I don't see anything at all. And he had a flashlight, you know, and had his gun and all that. And I'm still just shaking, you know, and Mama's scared now. So he tells me, he said, go in there and call your Aunt Overly. Now, my Aunt Overly was my mama's sister, and they had all grown up in that area. And Aunt Overly was already in her probably 60s at this time. So she had lived there forever and ever. And so I'm in there telling her what we just heard, roaring and growling and moaning on the phone, trying to make this sound. And she said, oh, honey, that's probably just Miss Clay Schulte's bulls across the street from us, you know. And Miss Clay Schulte was an elderly woman, lived there by herself, and she did. She had, you know, her husband had passed away, but she still had the bulls and the cows and the chickens and all that. There was a water tower over on the right side of her pasture and everything, and I'm telling you, we were in the country. Anyway, so that made me feel better, made my mama and daddy feel better, and so we slept okay. Well, the next day, Miss Clay Schulte was at our house because she would come and give Mama her shots for pain relief. And so she was up there in the front room. My daddy was in there, and he calls me and asked me to come up. You know, I was in the back of the house where the living room was at, and he said, Debbie, come up here and make that sound that we heard last night from Miss Clay Schulte. And she's just sitting there, you know, rocking in the rocking chair. And so he had already told her the story, and so I'm up there roaring and moaning and growling. And she's like, oh, Mr. Bob, I wish you hadn't told me that. And he said, no, it's okay, because Overly told me that it was probably y'all's bulls or something. And she said, oh, no, Mr. Bob, I don't have any of my cows or my bulls over there right now. They're all up in DeKalb. And I don't remember what was having done. I can't remember exactly. It's like they were being bred or something. But anyway, she said, there's none of my bulls or cows are over there right now. And she says, as a matter of fact, something's been stealing my chickens. Of course, we didn't know anything about anything at that time. We didn't know anything about Bigfoot. Looking back, I remember I was Daddy's girl, you know, and anywhere Daddy went, I helped him with everything. He had killed a possum one time that was up around the house, and it was late in the evening, so we didn't have time to bury it. And so he said, well, let's just go around back, we'll put it in the trash can. We had, you know, metal trash can. And so he said, we'll put it in the trash can, we'll come back out in the morning, we'll bury it. And so he put the lid on it, and he put a big old rock on top of the lid so nothing would get into it and get it. And so the next day, he called me and he said, come on, let's go out and bury the possum. And we go out the back door, and, you know, the trash can's still sitting there with the lid and the rock and everything. So he takes the rock off, takes the lid off. He said, looked at me, what'd you do? I said, what are you talking about? He said, the possum's gone. And I said, Daddy, I didn't get that possum. I didn't do anything with that possum. He said, you serious? And I said, no. And, you know, we had no clue what had happened, but that lid was still on it, and that rock was still on that lid. But that possum was gone. So something had to have taken that heavy. I mean, it was a big rock. It was at least, the rock was at least like a foot all the way around, foot width, you know, foot wide, foot high. It was a heavy rock. That was interesting. So now, looking back, I'm like, oh, yeah. And we would hear all sorts of stuff. We'd hear high-pitched screams. When we first moved there, I was a lot younger, but there was a railroad track on the other side of that water tower. And we used to hear screams, and it sounded like a woman screaming. And so, of course, Aunt Overly lived there, and we'd always call Aunt Overly anytime we didn't know what was going on. And she said, no, we thought it was the little old lady that lived in that little white house by the water tower getting beat up or something. And she was like, oh, no, that's that Black Panther that walks up and down the railroad tracks. And so that's just what I always thought, that was. And it may have been a panther for all I know. But yeah, there was lots of strange things going on around there.
And that wasn't really the catalyst that got you interested. You just reflect back on that and you put those things together, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, because there's...
I just love that. It's not the craziest story in the world.
Right.
It's not the most action-packed. But she told me that story 3 years ago? And
3 or
I
4.
asked her, I said, would you ever retell that on camera? And she goes, sure. And I haven't really seen her much or had an opportunity to do it since then. So
it's just so cool, looking back. And I remember too, I dated a guy from Foreman, Arkansas, and but I've always been interested in the Fouke monster. I just didn't know what it was. We knew that there was supposed to be a monster, and some people called him the boogeyman. My mama would always, when she said, well, you be careful going out there, the boogeyman will get you. We just thought that was a saying back then. But the Fouke monster, once we started hearing about the Fouke monster and stuff, and then the movie was made about Boggy Creek, we thought, okay, even though Mama and Daddy is telling us it's not real, when you start having people in the area talking about it, you listen to that stuff. A guy I dated was from Foreman, Arkansas, and he had said that him and his daddy would go hunting in Foreman, and that's not too far from Fouke either, He said that he remembers one time that they were coming out of the woods, they had parked alongside of the road, and there was a big pasture out there, and then the pasture was lined with trees and stuff, and he said that we're sitting in the front yard of my house in the car talking about this, and because I had told him about what I had heard, a couple of years earlier, because I was dating him when I was 16 and he was 17, and so we're talking about stuff, and I was telling him about what I had heard when I was 14 and everything, and so he starts telling me this, and he said, well, we were loading up the truck, putting our guns and stuff in there, and my daddy kept staring across the pasture. And he goes, and I looked over there, and he said, what are you looking at? And he goes, do you see that creature? And he said there was an upright creature walking along the tree line on the backside of the pasture, and it just went into the woods. And I remember, but while he was telling me that, I was like, do you think it could have been the Fouke monster? And he slung his car door up and went, ah! Like he was being pulled out of the car. And I screamed bloody murder, and my daddy came out on the front porch to see what was going on. But what's funny is we're Facebook friends, now on Facebook, and he had been living in North Carolina, and him and his family were going to move back to Arkansas, but they found a cattle farm in Oklahoma, so they're living in Oklahoma now. And I'll post stuff on my Facebook sometimes, my personal Facebook about Bigfoot. And then I share the show and stuff, and then I'll delete it after I've shared it and stuff. But anyway, so he was seeing Bigfoot stuff. And so he messaged me after he moved to Oklahoma, and where he's living now is not far from where we recorded the gibberish, what we call Tribulation Bay. So he started asking me questions. Well, does Bigfoot do this, and do they do that, and do they do this? And so finally I said, why are you asking me all this stuff? And he said, well, my daughter's dating a guy, and he said that he's been hearing some weird stuff, and he's describing all this stuff. And I'm like, that sounds really interesting, Todd. And he goes, well, do you think it could be Bigfoot? And I said, I think it could. I don't know if it is, but I think it could. And I said, where does he live? And he was telling me, and so I'm pulling up Google Maps. He said he lives just like 3 miles from me. And so he's telling me where he lives. I said, can you just send me a pin, on Google Maps? It was like 5 miles from Tribulation Bay where we recorded the gibberish.
Wow.
And I told him, I said, you don't want to hear what I'm fixing to tell you. And he's like, what? And I said, your house is real close to this? And he's like, yeah. And I said, let me send you a link. And so I sent him the link that Carrie Arnold did on Sisters of the Moon where we're talking about all that.
Yeah.
I said, you're going to hear a story where we recorded gibberish and had a lot of activity. I said, that's about 5 miles from y'all's farm. And he was like, yeah. So now he's all the time sending me stuff. But it's pretty cool.